Hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Mind the Bleep webinars on preparing how to be an F1. Today, we're going to be joined by Stephanie Lausanne from MD, who's going to tell us all about complaints. We're going to have Q&A session afterwards, so please make sure you send all the questions in the chat if they just pop to your mind, or you can save them all till the end. We'll make sure to answer them all, and the session will be recorded. We'll send you the link, which you can access anytime, and the materials will be available for you later. Make sure you're registered at the mindthebleep.com for the weekly webinars. I'm going to post the link for the webinars registration so you can access it later. And before we start, I would like to also give a shout out to our sponsors, the MD. Don't forget to sign up for the MD Foundation membership before you start shadowing, because unless you filled in the foundation application form, your student membership will cease in the summer. So it's essential that you have your indemnity cover. So check out the MDU's website, and the sign up link I'm going to post again in the chat, so you can access it anytime. And Lausanne is representing MD, so she can answer all of your questions. If you have any questions, as I did say, just let us know, and I hope you do enjoy the session. And I'm just going to hand over to Lausanne. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Right, good evening, everybody. So Akash has asked me to come and talk to you about dealing with complaints. Now, I don't want you to think that you are definitely going to get complaints, like serious complaints as an F1. Not everybody does, okay? But it is important to kind of know how to deal with them, because dealing with it as a professional and in the right way is the most important way that you can actually protect yourself. Okay, so I'm going to take you through this. We're going to talk about a few examples, and there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. Okay, right, there we go. So we're going to start with what is a complaint, what actually constitutes and qualifies as a complaint as such. Now, it is important to note that in the English Nhs Complaints legislation, there's absolutely no legal definition of this, which is very, very difficult sometimes. But what we adopt at the MDU, and we think you should adopt too, is that a complaint is any expression of dissatisfaction that you can't ignore, something you have to respond to. Okay. Now, generally that is quite straightforward, and generally our advice is always to respond to complaints, because things can really escalate. And I'm going to give you a brief example of that later as well. So moving on, the aims and objectives of tonight's session is we're going to talk about the Nhs Complaints Process. That is really important to know about, because you guys as F1s working for the NHS, you have a responsibility to make sure that that process happens. Okay, and if you don't, or if you get in the way of it, you could potentially find yourself in trouble. All right, so we're going to tell you about that. We're going to talk about the types of complaints that come from patients, so you know which areas to just potentially be a little bit more careful with, or give a little bit more attention to. We're going to talk about what a good quality response looks like. Okay. And I will say very much, remember, we're looking at things from, in a perfect world, this is what we would like you to do. All right. We can't tell you what to do, and we can't make you do it. So it is very important to remember we look at it from that point of view. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this reason why it's so important to deal with complaints. Very, very good from the start if possible. Okay. So the Nhs Complaints Procedure, first of all. So this is where patients have the right, enshrined in law to complain about the service that they get from the NHS. Okay, now the law of course differs in the different jurisdictions of the UK. So if you are, moving to Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland, there could be slight differences. Tonight I'm going to concentrate on England, okay, because that's where I live and that's what I know. But most of the things are relevant to all the jurisdictions. They might be slightly different, like headings to things, what they're called. My main advice would be that if you ever kind of worry about it, do get the proper kind of documentation and have a look at it. You will probably, I'd be very surprised if you don't get a copy or some training on this when you go to your F1 induction. Okay, so talking about the complaints process in England, it's very much a two-stage process. So the idea is that, you know, any organisation that provides NHS care in England or adult social care in England, they have to adhere to this. And the idea is that this complaints process concentrates and tries to resolve things locally, but it gives the patient the right to escalate things further if they're not happy with the local response. Okay. This complaints process, as I said, any organisation that provides NHS healthcare, so it's your GPs, your pharmacists, your opticians, ambulance services, and of course hospital, anybody really who can call themselves a responsible body. All right. Now, in the case where you perhaps have a complicated or joint complaint, so two different you know, companies are involved in it, let's say a GP and the hospital, they're part of the complaint, then usually the organisation with the most to answer for will take charge of handling the complaint. Unless, of course, you have potentially a single practice GP, sorry, a single GP practice where, you know, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to investigate themselves. Okay, so that kind of thing. And very importantly is about how quickly a response is required for this kind of thing. So I've got a bit of a graph here, if you bear with me. So the main thing you guys need to remember is, number one, if somebody makes a complaint to you, remember that's any kind of expression of dissatisfaction that shouldn't be ignored. And basically, we don't want anything ignored. If the complaint is made to you verbally or orally, then you have to ask the question, can I resolve this person's complaint within 24 hours? Okay, so is it a really simple complaint, somebody telling you they want a glass of water and nobody's brought them one? Can you fix that by taking them a glass of water? Or, you know, somebody was rude to them or let's say they complain that you were rude and then you go and you apologize and they're happy with that. They don't want to escalate things. That is all settled within 24 hours. So that does not have to go through the proper complaints procedure. Okay, everything else does. If they complain to you and you can't resolve it within 24 hours, or if they take the time to actually write their complaint down, it has to legally go through the proper complaints process. Okay, now what that involves is, number one, and your involvement in that is, if you're the person they're complaining to, you have to, number one, tell them that there's an NHS complaints procedure and help them get access to that. Number two, if you can't do that, make sure you escalate the matter ASAP. All right, and that is because the NHS, the organisation that you work for, has 3 days to formally acknowledge the fact that they've received the complaint. And those 3 days start the moment you become aware of it. Okay, so if you're the person that is the first in line to get this complaint, you've got to make sure that it gets actioned. And that's really, really important. If the NHS don't respond to a complaint within those 3 days, and it's 3 days, it's not 3 weekdays or anything like that, okay? It includes the weekends. If they don't acknowledge it within 3 days, then they can get into a lot of trouble and they can potentially get fines from the Ombudsman as well. So you can imagine that if you're the reason, either you forgot to tell anybody about the complaint or you just didn't treat it as urgent or anything like that, then, you know, you can imagine that they will have to look into why this has happened as well. All right, so that's the most important thing. Somebody complains to you, if you can't resolve it, make sure somebody else knows about it. Make sure you take it up the management chain. All right. Now, once the organisation knows about this, they'll write to the complainant saying that they know about this complaint and they will be investigating it. And then they have to do that in what is called a timely fashion. Another place hospitals have got into trouble because, a timely fashion does not excuse for holidays or staff shortages or anything like that. The hospital has to do its absolute best to investigate and respond to the complainant as soon as possible. All right. That they will create an investigation team, and they'll interview people, find out what was going on, and we'll talk more about how that works later. Once they've done their response, they have to reply to the patient, and the patient or complainant will then decide whether they're happy with the response. Sometimes, and most often, you will also kind of include a meeting right before to kind of make sure everything's answered too. If they're happy with the response, great, the case is resolved and they can close that. If they're not happy with it, oops, sorry, wrong way, then they have the right to take the complaint to the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman may use the information gathered by the hospital team to make their decision about whether or not the complaint has been answered fully, or they can, and they do sometimes, do brand new investigations and get external bodies involved. All right, so it can obviously escalate into something much more serious. So to recap, your involvement is mostly if you become aware of it, try and resolve the complaint straight away. If it's oral, if it's been written and it can't be resolved, make sure that you tell somebody about it straight away. Okay, and I would, in this case, say don't tell a colleague, tell somebody more senior. All right, don't just pass on the job. All right.
I'm really sorry, Lazanne.
That's
I have
okay.
to interrupt very, very quickly because of the technical issue. I think you might have to click to the display settings and change it to the presentation view. I'm really sorry.
Well, can you see my slides? No.
Yes, I'm really sorry for that.
I'm not going to bother with that. So you guys can see what's coming up next. It's not a problem.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I apologize. Right. Thank you.
No, it's fine. It's been a while since I used Zoom, so who knows. Okay, so that is the complaints procedure. So we're going to move on to our first case. I'm just going to hide this bit there. Now, we have written this as in we want you to kind of imagine yourself in these shoes, but I do kind of promise you we're not that creative. Most of these cases are based on real things. So imagine yourself now working on a general medical ward and you're asked to review a patient in a side room. When you enter the room, the daughter of the patient is there. Before you can say anything, the daughter makes it really clear that she's unhappy with, because she's had to wait for a long time to speak to a doctor and now she's going to be late getting back to work. Okay, so you can imagine not that unheard of. You'll get these patients, okay, these complainants. You suggest to the daughter that you, of course, first examine her mum because the patient has to be your first priority, and then you will go and speak to her afterwards. Okay, so think a little bit about what you potentially are going to have to, think about when it comes to this. It is a complaint. Okay, so is it a complaint? Yes, it is. But in this case, this is a very, very minor issue. It was made to you verbally. So if you can resolve it, then it doesn't have to go through the full complaints procedure and use up all those resources. Okay, so what will you consider before speaking to the daughter? Now, again, we look at it from a medical legal point of view. So there's a few things we want you to kind of think about. And most importantly here is consent. Okay, so you need to make sure that when you go and examine the patient's the complainant's mother, okay, get permission right then and there about what you can and can't discuss about the patient's clinical issues with the daughter. And the reason we say this is you want this interaction to go smoothly, and you want to come out as a confident doctor and have the complainant, reestablish the rapport and everything. Okay, so that's the ideal thing that you want to try and do here. If you make sure that you find out all these things beforehand, then the conversation that you're going to go have with the daughter is going to go much more smoothly. So make sure that you have the consent. If you don't have the consent, that's fine too, but then you have that answer already. So when you go and speak to the daughter, once you've apologized about the fact that they've had to wait, because you always apologize, is the polite thing to do, But once you apologize to them, the next question they're going to ask you is, okay, well, how's my mum? So you need to ideally know whether or not you can discuss things. And if you can't, you can then confidently say, oh, do you know what? I did ask your mum, but she didn't want me to talk about it. Okay, so that is for good. It shows conscientious, it shows you as forward thinking. Now, when you speak to the daughter, there is almost a magic way, a magic way, 4 things that you should always include in any kind of, whether it's a verbal response to a complaint or any kind of interaction with patients as well. But there's 4 main things I want you to think about, and I will reiterate it a little bit as we go through things. Number 1 is an apology. You must apologize. Okay, you're not admitting guilt or anything like that. You're apologizing for the fact that they've been through something or that they're unhappy. And that is purely the polite thing to do. Okay, then you have to try and give an explanation, but be very, very careful not to kind of go into the realm of giving excuses. Okay, an explanation is fine. We're extremely busy on the ward today, things like that. That's absolutely fine. But don't get an excuse as in, oh, I don't know why, it had nothing to do with me. Okay, that's not actually useful. Empathy, of course, always make sure that you do empathize and that you show it to the people you're talking with. It's not just good enough to really have it. They have to experience it from you as well. And then lastly, come up with a remedy. Give them a solution. Okay, so apology, explanation, empathy, and remedy. Those 4 things will be in every good patient complaint response, or even breaking bad news sometimes as well. Okay, and then lastly, the thing again from our kind of medical legal hat, what we want you to do is document very clearly in the records what this patient and complainant have said. Okay, have they accepted the fact that, do they say to you that, yeah, they don't want to take this complaint any further? So then you put it in the notes, the fact that you believe that this complainant was satisfied with the response and that this thing is settled. Okay, if not, then you say you don't believe the patient or complainant was satisfied with the response. You've given them the details of how to make a formal complaint, things like that. Okay, but always put it in the records. Okay, right. So just a couple of comments and concerns just from our kind of experience and things. Issues that hospitals generally have is that frontline staff very rarely get all the right training in how to respond to complaints in a positive way. Okay, they're scared of it. They tend to kind of push things up the ladder. Sometimes any kind of training that you can go to or that you can provide if you're one in charge one day, to get your frontline staff to deal with the small complaints there and then is going to save your organization and your team so much hassle. Okay, and it's so much better for the patients and to keep them trusting you as well. Okay, so whatever you can do, that's really, really important. Of course, it may seem very, very uncomfortable, especially if it's something that's just completely not in your control. It's just like waiting times again. It is something people complain about. Again, if you deal with it up front and you have the right training and the confidence, then, they're not going to go home and take that with them and then bring it back next time. Okay, and that's very, very important as well. And it's also very important to note any kind of potential errors, near misses, and that kind of thing. All right. Now, a lot of people often ask us, like, should I really apologize? Doesn't an apology in itself amount to me accepting, I don't know, admission of negligence or a breach of duty of some sort? And the answer to that is absolutely no. Okay. If you make an apology that you're sorry for something that you did or not, that you either did or didn't do, then it's not an admission that you are responsible for any damages that may be suffered because of it. That's a mouthful, I understand that. Okay, you just need to remember an apology is not an admission of liability, so don't worry about apologizing and the legal things of that. Okay, however, a good apology is a lot better than a bad apology, but a bad apology is still better than no apology. Okay, ideally we want you to give a good apology. Now, again, with apologies, empathy, honesty, and openness, they're much, much more likely to actually prevent complaints and claims than they are actually to cause them. Okay, right. So what do people complain about? Very quickly, just some stats for you. We haven't had the latest figures in for the COVID year just quite yet. We expect there will be some complaints, but in most cases, there's around 208,000 complaints every year. And I just think in this graph, what's interesting is the things that people complain about. Okay, so they complain about communication. A large chunk of complaints has to do with communication. And you will hear us talk about communication all the time. The most important thing you can do is communicate well. But that is also the first thing that goes out the window the moment people are stressed, the moment they are overworked. It's hard to consistently communicate well. Okay, so that is something you should always try and keep in the back of your mind. Then the next one there, the orange one, patient care, hydration, food, that kind of thing. And then lastly, values of and behaviors of staff. And again, values and behaviors of staff is something that you can kind of think about. So when you have to kind of always remember that when your patients are lying on the wards and stuff, they're watching you guys all the time. So if they see, one doctor treating another badly, they will complain about it. If they see, if they feel that they're not being treated well, of course, they're going to complain about it as well. They very often complain about behavior of doctors when doctors think they're not being watched. All right. It's part of life and you can't be perfect all the time. We're not saying you can. It is worth just kind of remembering this, there's always eyes somewhere on the ward. Okay, right. So responding to complaints, we move on to this. We're going to come up with our second case. Now, again, I think this is quite a simple one, and you will probably imagine that this might happen to you. All right, it happened to this guy. So FY2 on nights, he was working very, very hard, and they had a very busy night, and all the minor cases were backing up, and it was just an absolutely madhouse in the A&E that night. Pardon. This doctor hadn't eaten or been to the toilet since his shift started, and he really was working as hard as he can to try and clear the backlog. And a 92-year-old lady came in who had had a fall at home. Okay. The family was already upset about the fact that they had been waiting in A&E for quite a while. And finally, when the doctor went to go see them, they said to him as he entered the room, he said, "Oh, it's about time too." Okay. So there was two responses. The first is what we would have liked to see. And I want to kind of point out to you again the empathy, apology, explanation, and remedy. Okay, so I'm really sorry you've been kept waiting. The department has been unusually busy, which means there's delays in other patients being seen. I understand how upsetting it must be to have your mum waiting, and I'll do my best now to get things moving along. Okay, very nice, simple response. Unfortunately, what the doctor said that night was, "Can't you see that we're busy? I've not had a break or drink in 9 hours. I'm working as fast as I can. There were genuine emergencies that needed to be seen. Now, why have you brought your mum into the A&E in the middle of the night?" Okay. Now, this was not a bad doctor. This was a doctor on a bad day. And unfortunately, yes, this did turn into a complaint. And it escalated to an internal disciplinary investigation, and the doctor received a verbal warning from the hospital for this one. Okay, that is unfortunately a reality of things too. You can't talk to people like that. Okay. Case 3, and this one is more in depth. So again, if you bear with me, I'm just going to talk you through it, okay? So I am writing to say how disappointed I am at the care that I've had from your department. As you know, I've been admitted with a PE and with sepsis, both of which I know can be life-threatening conditions. When I started my chemo, I was given an information leaflet about sepsis. I kept a check of my temperature, and when I went home and I called the ward when my temperature fell below 35 degrees, I explained that I wasn't feeling well, but I was told that only a high temperature was important and told not to worry. The next day, my partner had to bring me to A&E after I collapsed at home. I told the nurse on the ward that I had a DVT in my leg years ago. They told me not to worry about it and that I wouldn't need any preventative treatment because I would soon be on my feet. I was in hospital for a week and I complained that I was a bit short of breath, was again told not to worry, this time by a doctor who didn't even examine me. The day after I was discharged, my partner had to call an ambulance and the doctor in A&E told me I could have died. I'm disgusted by this treatment and I want to know what you will do to stop this happening again. Okay, right. So what do patients want when they complain? And it's very much the things that we told you should be in the answer to that complaint. They want an explanation, they want to feel heard, they want an apology, okay? They want improvements to the service. And I think that is very, very important. The vast majority of people who complain will say to you that the reason that they complained is not just for themselves, it's because they don't want this to happen to somebody else. The vast majority, okay? And of course, they want the institution they're complaining about to accept that they've done something wrong and to be willing to fix things. What they definitely don't want is their issues to be trivialized or being told that it's not important or that they're unreasonable. They don't want to be made to feel that they're to blame for what has gone wrong. If only they had spoken up, this would never have happened. They don't want to be given excuses. They don't want to hear that, oh, it's not my job or it's not my responsibility. They don't know the inner workings. For them, you are part of the institution. Okay, and they also definitely don't want to have to jump through multiple procedural stages. They don't want to have to go to one and then not get any justice and go to another and not get any justice. Okay, so with that in mind, with this case, the complaints department set up an investigatory team and they had a look and they started gathering evidence to kind of see, they needed to know the facts of what is right and wrong and what has happened. So amongst other things that they looked for, they went and found a copy of the leaflet about sepsis. They had a look at the medical notes to see who the patient spoke to over the phone. They had a look at the department's VTE risk assessment to kind of see, what should have been done, what is the rules, that kind of thing. And they went and had a look at the medical notes to see who was the last doctor to see this patient just before discharge. Okay. So the information leaflet made it very clear that a temperature below 35 degrees Celsius could indicate infection. So the patient was right, he did the right thing in calling in. There was at the time, unfortunately, no evidence of who spoke to the patient on the phone, and there was no note or record, and conversations weren't being taped or, for records or anything like that. So since then, the hospital made a change here, and every phone call now a form had to be filled in for every phone call. They had a look at the VTA risk assessment, and it appears that the nurses didn't really take all the rules into account. They needed to think about the previous DVT. And again, to put yourself into this doctor's shoes, I want you to imagine that you were the last doctor, the one who kind of didn't examine the patient. Okay, imagine yourself in that situation. So the complaints team will then come to you and ask you, we would like a statement of your involvement. This is the bit where we know you were involved. Okay. So it's very important to kind of think about who can you turn to for help. There is plenty of help available, and it's really important that you get some feedback and advice. Okay. Of course, you can come to us. That's a given. Okay. But also, you can, of course, very much go to your supervising consultant, your educational supervisor, even the doctor who's just got a little bit more experience of you will have valuable input to how what you potentially need to do next and so forth. Okay, what should you consider? Well, you will probably need to add this complaint to your e-portfolio. You'll have to reflect on it, learn from it. identify areas where you could have done better, and potentially come up with a way to include those areas as well. Okay, and if it's a serious case, you will also have to probably review the case as well. Okay, what should you include in your response? Well, I think the first thing to really understand and appreciate is that any complaint you get is going to be a stressful event. Nobody likes being complained about, and you definitely don't want to be complained about when you've already had a rough week. Okay, so acknowledge the fact that if you receive a complaint, it's not going to be a nice thing. All right, it often feels really, really unfair. So it's very, very important that you take the time to compose yourself, focus. You need to kind of look through everything, think about what had happened, all of that. And you can't do that when you're running around doing 50 different chores. Okay. Start your first draft, Consider, of course, that you are not just answering, even though the people asking you for the statement is the complaints department, you need to write your response to the patient, okay, to the complainant. So address their experience. Don't think about the fact that, oh, they've got it wrong and they're being unfair. Think about, if I was them, what do I want to hear? All right. So it's not just about the facts and the figures and the medical talk. You really need to make sure that that complaint is addressed to the patient. Okay. Then once you've done that, get some feedback from people. Again, we would be happy to look over it for you as well. See if they read it the way that you intend. Okay. Make sure that when you do answer this, you have the most up-to-date clinical records. So you need to know if anything at the time, maybe the information wasn't available. You need to know that it wasn't available and that there's something new now. All of those things. Give a full chronological account of your involvement. Okay, don't stray into speculating about what other people did or what other people said. Stick to what you did. All right. Again, apologize if it's appropriate. And again, we pretty much say always apologize. It does not cost you a thing, and people appreciate apologies. Okay. If nothing else, if you can imagine going to a restaurant and the food isn't quite up to the standard that you wanted, the moment the waitress says to you, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't like it, she didn't cook it, but you do want them to just acknowledge the fact that you're unhappy, and apology is the quickest way to do that. All right. If things could have been better, say so clearly. And it's really important in your response to say what you've learned and what you would potentially do different. Okay. So coming on to why it is so extremely important to respond well. It's something called multiple jeopardy, okay? But it's also very much your ethical responsibility, as with your GMC guidance, okay? So the GMC says you must, and if you guys haven't heard me say this before, when you read GMC guidance, you always look for the musts and the shoulds. It really helps you decide like what you absolutely must do. Don't let anybody else tell you different, especially consultants sometimes, and what you should do. Okay, and that's what you must try to do. So you must respond promptly, fully, and honestly to complaints and apologize when it's appropriate. You must not allow a patient's complaint to adversely affect the care or treatment you provide or arrange. Okay, so it's always about stay professional, but you have to deal with it. You cannot ignore it. All right. Now, for you guys, why it's so important to deal with complaints really well is something called multiple jeopardy. And you may very well have heard me talk about this. We go on about this quite a bit. Okay. Multiple jeopardy is where you can have a single incident, and out of that single incident, a whole range of different interested parties, different investigations, different outcomes of investigations. Just because you're innocent of a crime revolving that incident doesn't mean that you're not going to be potentially found unfit to practice. Okay, they're independent of each other, and that's very, very important. It means that these things can become quite complicated, and that's all I really want to say about it. Okay, get advice, make sure you follow all the right rules right from the beginning. That's the best advice I can give you right now. Okay, right. But it's not all going to happen to you. It's just in case, rather safe than sorry. So we've done for you 2 responses. Again, this is based on our experience. So please, we do know what we're talking about. The first response is what we do see sometimes. It is not something we would advise, but we've made it here for you so you can kind of see what's likely to happen. Okay, so there's some speculation going on here, of course, but it is based on experience. So first response, I've been asked to reduce the statement in response to Mr. X's complaint. I was asked to see him by the nursing staff to confirm some details on his discharge prescription. The nursing staff did not report to me that he was short of breath. I've written that the patient told me he felt short of breath, but I recall that his observations were normal and that he'd been cleared for discharge on the ward round earlier the same day. I do not consider that it was anything else that I needed to do. Okay, so very straightforward, very plain, but it doesn't do those 4 things. It doesn't show empathy. There's no apology. It doesn't really get an explanation of what was going on. More, oh, they didn't tell me, or I assumed things. Okay, and also, there's no real remedy. The doctor here doesn't say that he thinks he should have done anything any differently. So that, unfortunately, is not going to sit well with the patient who gets that. So what the hospital will do, if that's the statement that you provide, is they could very well include the statement as it is in the response to the patient, which means the patient is going to read that. They're not going to be happy with that. Okay, they're just not. So if they're not happy with that, either they're going to lose faith in the investigation process itself, escalate things to the ombudsman, or they could potentially, of course, refer that particular doctor to the GMC as well. This patient has suffered harm, so it is possible that they could sue the hospital as well, just to kind of demonstrate the multiple jeopardy of how things can escalate. And of course, that kind of response, you may very well have, your employer investigate you as well as part of the disciplinary proceedings. Okay, so to show you outcome 1, lots of different things can happen. Okay, so our job and what we try to do is make sure that if there's going to be a complaint, we try our best to make sure that it doesn't escalate into anything else. And one of the best ways you can do that is by providing a proper response. Okay, because again, imagine the patient now reading this one. And I've highlighted for you all the important words that are in there. And I want you to think about those 4 things again. Think about apology, think about explanation, think about remedy, and all of that, and empathy as well. Okay, so think about those things. I was sorry to hear of Mr. X's complaint. I've reflected on my interaction with him, and I recognize that I could have dealt with this differently. I was asked to see him about his discharge prescription. During our conversation, he mentioned that he fell short of breath. I recall that I checked his most recent obs, and all of them, including his oxygen saturations, were normal. I was reassured that he'd been seen shortly before on the ward round and cleared for discharge. I cannot be certain that I examined his chest, and I've not recorded that I did so, so therefore I think that he must be correct and that I didn't do it. Okay, that's a big thing. I've reflected at length on this consultation and discussed it with my educational supervisor and recorded it in my portfolio. I recognize that I was falsely reassured by the discharge decision made on the ward round, and I didn't assess Mr. X as I normally would. I accept that an examination of his chest would have been indicated and a further assessment of his current oxygen saturations. I wish to offer my sincere apologies to the patient that I did not do this at the time. As a result of this complaint, I've reviewed the hospital guidance on VTE, everybody had to do that, and completed an online CPD module on the assessment of pulmonary embolism. I've reviewed my record keeping and asked my educational supervisor for help to audit my records. I was very sorry to hear that he was readmitted, and I wish him a full and speedy recovery. Okay, an absolute mouthful. You may very well feel that that's overkill, but imagine you're the patient. I think you'll agree that that's a much better response. and that you'll probably have a lot more empathy with the doctor who wrote that. Okay, so ideally, a good response will mean that the hospital can include that as part of the statement. The patient will be happy with that, not escalate things. Okay, of course, whether or not they sue because they need the money in order for future treatments, that's not up to you, and that's not against you personally anyway. Okay, you've done everything you can here to contain this, to stop it escalating into other areas. And as I said before, I think that's the most important way you can actually look after yourself. Okay, right. Then we're going to talk about reflection, just to kind of finish things off, because reflection, just like dealing with a complaint well, again, is one of the most important things that you can do to show your professionalism as a doctor. The GMC is really, really clear. You must reflect on all aspects of your professional work. This should be informed by discussion with others, specific evidence, data from audits, complaints, compliments, okay? And you should get the feedback and things, not just from your colleagues, but also from your patients, okay? And I think that's really, really important to kind of think about. This is the reflective practitioner, which is the guidance that you guys should adhere to when it comes to your reflective notes and everything. And I think it's really important that if you don't have a copy, make sure you do. It's a good one to read through. And I think we've taken a few quotes out for you just because of kind of the stuff that's been in the news and all of that. But it's very, very important to see that the GMC very, very much says quite clearly that they will not ask you to produce reflective statements, reflective notes, as, you know, they won't use those against you as such, okay? On the flip side of that, I think it's really important as well for you guys to realize that your reflective notes can actually be used to prove that you have learned lessons and done things and fixed things. Okay, so make sure you give your reflective notes the right the right attention and focus that you should. It's an important part of your training. And as I said before, if something does go wrong and you find out about it ages later, if you have a reflective note and evidence to show that you learned your lesson back then and you've been doing things differently since then that case isn't going to go anywhere. Okay. Right. So how to approach reflective notes? Again, it's really important to think about, you know, what is the issues? What have you reflected on? You know, what are you doing as a result of your reflection? It does not have to be really in-depth things. You know, you put as much as you want into it as you want to show. Okay. But it's really important also to think about, you know, what are you going to do different in the future? How are you going to make sure you do it? And do you have any learning tips for your colleagues? Okay, it's important that you share your information, because you don't really want to have patients go through exactly the same issue for your colleague to learn the lesson as well. Okay, so make sure you do share the knowledge. And then very lastly, I'm just going to say how to avoid complaints. We call it the 7 C's, right? So bear with me. Number 1, competence. It's extremely important that you know the limits of your competence and that you stick to it, okay? This year in particular, you know, a lot of doctors, you know, F1s are very, very worried that they're going to potentially show different competence levels because of, you know, the lack of clinical experience over the last year and things like that. So if you're missing something, if you're not confident, speak up straight away, okay? Don't pretend to know things that you don't. It's the worst thing you can do. Communication, work on it all the time, come up with things that work, okay? So the communication with your colleagues, with your patients, you know, handovers, record keeping, all of those different elements. Find a way that works well. Communication has to be effective. Otherwise, what's the point? Okay. Consent, explain things really, really clearly to your patients, the risks and the benefits. Check their understanding and check their consent and understanding all the way through. Okay. It's not just a one-off right at the beginning. Chaperones, you know, offer a chaperone for every intimate examination if you can. It is the gold standard. Make sure that your chaperone is a qualified person. Okay. document any discussion about it, especially if patients tell you that they don't want a chaperone. Okay, just make sure you keep a kind of note on it. It's one of the areas where complaints come from. Okay. Confidentiality, again, one of the easiest things to accidentally do is to breach confidentiality. Make sure you know who you're speaking to. Make sure that you look after data. Okay, all these lists you guys are walking around with all the time, treat them with respect. Make sure you shred things. If something goes missing, own up to it straight away. Okay, the hospital can deal with damage much better if they know it's happened. Okay, it will always come back to you eventually. So please don't try and hide if you've lost something. Okay, and don't take information off site unless you have permission to do so. Clinical records, again, I can speak to you for an hour on clinical records, but it is the most important tool that you have, not just for your patients, but for you to protect yourself with as well. You will get better at it. You will get, obviously, practice makes perfect, okay? But remember, clinical records, you need to kind of come up with a good thing, a good way of doing things, and rather safe than sorry, definitely, okay? And lastly, customer service, just remember that you have to treat your patients the way you would like to be treated. And you have to allow for the fact that some days you're not going to be 100% on your game. So if that's the case, then make sure you deal with it, okay? Or at least acknowledge it, because if you know it's happening, then you can deal with it, okay? And that's me. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Lausanne. That was such an interesting and informative presentation, which I'm sure is going to be useful for doctors and future doctors. I found it very, very interesting myself. We don't really have any questions in the chat.
That's good.
But if anyone can think of any questions, it would be amazing if you can pop the questions in the chat now. And in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen with the feedback form. So give everyone a couple of minutes to think about any questions they might have. Let me just share my screen. So you should all see the feedback form now. I'm also going to I'm going to post the feedback link in the chat. Let me just have a look at the chat. So I think somebody's asking about what the remedy would be. Would you mind just letting us know which case you're referring to? I think it was Ahmed who asked the question. So Ahmed is asking, he said that in one of the cases, the response that you quoted, the language use was very apologetic, and he acknowledges that apology is not an admission of blame, but he's asking whether there is any limit on how apologetic one should sound when replying.
I think as long as it's honest and from the heart, but you don't want to kind of overdo it to a point that a patient feels that you're potentially not being truthful. Okay. I think there's no limit to how apologetic you should be. I think apologizing once is absolutely fine, but if you feel you want to apologize twice, that's good. Maybe 3 times will be seen as harassment. So I would very much just kind of say, it depends on the very, very specific thing, okay? But generally, I'd say sorry once. Just make sure you do it in a way that the patient can appreciate it, okay? And if it's heartfelt and you've really thought it through and you've told them why you're sorry, then that's absolutely fine, okay? But yeah, it's very hard to kind of say once or twice or give you a number or anything like that.
Yeah. I think I completely agree. I feel like if the person who's apologizing is being honest, then there shouldn't be any limit to how there's no quantifiable
Yeah.
way, or I don't think that there's
And the
a
thing is as well, you might even, if you're very unlucky, you might find yourself in a very kind of contentious or serious case where where you don't get to apologize. They may take the apology to only be done by the consultant because it has to be that high up, in which you may not get to apologize yourself. This is more of thinking about, don't be scared to apologize. There's no reason in the world that you just can't just say it. It comes quite naturally if you feel it.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions? Please feel free to post them in the chat, and if they come to your mind at any point, just please message us on Facebook. Thank you so much, Lizanne. That was amazing and very, very useful. Just a reminder for everyone to please fill in the feedback form and just be as specific as you can, because that will help us improve the future webinars. And that's it from us today. We would like to just remind you to join us for the session next week, and please join the Tuesday sessions on the Finance Medic. That's it from me. Is there anything you'd like to add, Lizanne?
No, sounds good to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.